Welcome to the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. I'm Michaela. This is episode 12, season 4. This episode was recorded on March 12th and is with the one, the only, Jocko Willink. Dad has been on Jocko's podcast several times in the past, but now had the opportunity to reverse the interviewing role to learn more about Jocko's life and endeavors. They discussed Jocko's experience in the military and war-exploring time in the Navy SEALs, Afghanistan and Iraq, and much more. Jocko Willink is an American best-selling author, podcaster, and retired naval officer who served in the Navy SEALs. Jocko also has one of the most successful podcasts out there, the Jocko Podcast. Please remember to rate and subscribe if you enjoy this content. This episode is brought to you by NordVPN. I don't know how this is allowed, but with NordVPN, you can unlock Netflix and your favorite entertainment websites. I use one while I'm traveling. Did you know you can't get Disney in some countries? NordVPN has a 30-day money-back guarantee and unlimited bandwidth. A VPN connection establishes a secure connection between you and the internet. Via the VPN, all your data traffic is routed through an encrypted virtual tunnel. NordVPN has an extension for Chrome browser, which is lightweight and user-friendly with the first click. It secures your browsing in seconds. You can have 6 simultaneous connections, and for NordVPN's birthday, every purchase of a 2-year plan will get you 1 additional month free and a surprise gift. Go to nordvpn.com/Peterson and use code Peterson. Enjoy this episode.
Hi, everybody. I'm pleased today to be talking with Jocko Willink, who I've talked with on his podcast on 3 separate occasions. I don't think I've had Jocko on mine, and my memory isn't what it should be. But I'm quite sure that so far when we've talked, it's been on your podcast. So I thought I'd take the time today to get to know you in some more detail. Jocko is an American author, podcaster, and retired naval officer who served in the Navy SEALs. He co-authored the books Extreme Ownership and The Dichotomy of Leadership with fellow retired SEAL Leif Babin. Did I pronounce that right?
It's actually Leif Babin.
Oh, so I didn't pronounce it right at all. Leif Babin. He hosts a weekly podcast with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner Echo Charles called the Jocko Podcast. He has 1 million subscribers on YouTube, and his podcast attracts many more listeners. He co-founded the management consulting firm Echelon Front LLC and has extended his business development on a number of additional fronts. His military service included combat actions in the war in Iraq, where he eventually commanded the SEAL Teams 3 Task Unit Bruiser that fought in the battle against the Iraqi insurgents in Ramadi, and was honored with the Silver Star and Bronze Star for his service. He achieved the rank of Lieutenant Commander. Good to see you again, Jocko.
It's good to be here.
I feel the same way, that it's good to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I'm glad that you were able to gut through that ridiculously long bio. And I felt that as you got to the end of it, you were breaking free of the chains of that reading. So I'm glad it's over with. Yeah, well, it's so much better just to talk than to read in this sort of format. But at least everybody who doesn't know already has some sense of who you are, some minimal sense of who you are. So tell me what's been happening online with you over the last couple of years, because we haven't spoken. I would say it's got to be 2 years, I think, something like that. And so I've cast an eye on what's been happening with you on YouTube, and some of my staff have filled me in, but I'm really curious. Tell me about what's happening with your YouTube channel and your online activities, your podcast, and all of that.
A few years ago, I started a podcast. It was quite a few years ago now. It was in 2015. It might have been kind of prior to the explosion of podcasts. In fact, I think I read something that said at that time, it was like 17% of Americans were listening to podcasts, and that number's much, much higher now. And I kind of got lucky because at the time, Tim Ferriss had one of the most popular, still very popular, but at the time, just because the numbers of podcasts that existed, his podcast was even more popular. And I went on his podcast, and when we got done recording and he pressed stop on the record button, he looked at me and said, "You should have your own podcast." And I kind of took that, and noted it. And then a little while later, I was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he had, obviously another one of the most popular podcasts in the world. And he told me in the middle of that podcast that I should have my own podcast. And so when guys like Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan are telling you to have your own podcast, you have your own podcast. Now, I came to realize later that Joe Rogan actually would tell everybody to have a podcast. So maybe, he would tell everyone, "Oh, you should start a podcast." Well, I actually listened to him. And so I started that podcast, and I would say I probably, if somebody would have asked, what should a person do to make a good podcast, or maybe not a good podcast, but a popular podcast, somebody would probably say, make it probably a half an hour to an hour, bring a bunch of different guests on so that you can hear a bunch of different people talking, and, talk about positive things in the world. And so instead of doing any of that, what I did was I have a podcast that's between 2 and 5 hours long. Oftentimes it's just me talking, reading from a book and reviewing a book. And usually the books are about war or suffering or some kind of human atrocity. And so that's what my podcast is. And really what it boils down to is it's learning about human nature. And for me, human nature is best revealed, or most clearly revealed, in times of suffering. And one of the, I guess, a pretty good monopoly on the market for suffering is war, and right in there as well as, human atrocities. So I started that podcast, and like I said, when I started it, there weren't as many as podcasts as there are now. So it got some traction out of the gate, and it kind of just stayed there. So I was very lucky in that respect, and I've been doing it ever since. I've put out one podcast a week for 5 years. I've only missed one week in there, and that was when my best friend was killed in a parachute accident, and so I didn't put out a podcast that week. But other than that, I've been very consistent. And then the YouTube channel is, well, it's kind of the podcast, and then we do some excerpts there and little clips and stuff like that. And Echo Charles, I forget what you called him in the bio, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. He's also a video guy, and so he makes little clips and puts special effects in them and stuff, because he's creative and bored, which means
it's a great combination for someone that you're working with.
It is indeed. So I think that's what's been happening online for me and for the past few years.
Who's your audience, do you think, or do you know?
Yeah, I know actually quite well that my demographic is people. It's people, it's human beings. Really, it's all over the place. And when I go and do live events, I'll have just the entire spectrum of humans there. Hey, look, is there a kind of a typical person? Yeah, there's a typical person, but we get everybody on the spectrum, from the grandma to the little kids. I've written a bunch of kids books, and the little kids show up as well.
Right.
So pretty broad.
Kids books.
Yeah, pretty broad demographic. I meet all kinds of people. Everybody from I'll meet a firefighter, and then a hedge fund guy, and then a stay-at-home mom, and then a retired Marine. It just meet everybody. And that's the audience.
Do you have any sense of what it is that's attracting people to your podcast? I mean, you sort of approach that tongue in cheek in some sense for a dark topic. You concentrate on things that are pretty negative, or they're pretty dark. And so, as you said, that might fly in the face of any advice you'd get about what to talk about. But obviously, I mean, one of the things I've encountered is that there's a vast hunger for serious dialogue. And I mean, one of the things that struck me always about your podcast was you often read something that's very, very emotionally demanding. stark, harsh, rough. And and it's interesting to think about why people might be attracted to that. What's your sense? And also, why are you doing it?
I think that it's emotional. I think that these are emotional topics. I think these are things that people can be a little bit afraid of and a little bit nervous about, and being able to brush up against them a little bit gives them a little bit more familiarity with them. And therefore, when you come close to things that are that stark and dark and horrible, it also makes you look up around at the present situation that you're in, and maybe it doesn't look as awful. So
there you touched on two things about knowing something about history that might be really useful, or about human affairs, right? One is that, it's a tenet of clinical psychotherapy that a voluntary approach to what's frightening, threatening, even disgusting is curative. It has to be voluntary, and it can't be too intense, right? Because if it gets too intense, it can actually hurt you. But if it's voluntary and measured, that actually seems to strengthen people. It develops resilience. And I would say that's one thing that virtually all well-trained clinicians agree on, is that kind of exposure, whether it's discussing old, difficult experiences in an autobiographical manner, or whether it's actually going out into the world and facing things that you're afraid of. If you're an elevator phobic, for example, you might be faced with confronted with the necessity of at least looking at an elevator, which is something you might avoid if you're phobic. And then, so that's the first thing. So there is some pronounced human tendency to be attracted to what's dark, because that is a pathway to mental and physical resilience. And then the second thing is, which I also think is extremely important, is it's useful to cultivate gratitude, in my estimation. And one of the ways that you can do that, because you take a lot of what's good in your life for granted, it gets invisible, especially if it's predictable. It gets invisible, and that's unfortunate because it's still rare and precious. And if you know how terrible things can be, have been, or could become, then that can alert you to how fortunate you are when all hell isn't breaking loose right now everywhere in your life. So,
yeah, and you can also sort of learn some skill sets of how to handle these tough situations when you get in them. And if you can see that someone went through something that's much worse, and what did they do to deal with it? How did they get through it? What did they think about? What did they do? You can say, okay, well, I've seen that before. And the situation I'm in isn't quite as bad, but I know that person took action. I know that person stood up and made a move and made things happen and tried to move forward. And maybe that's what I should do too. So you can definitely garner some skills from the past. And
right. So that's a third element, is that it can expand your notion of human competence. And that's, I think that's one of the reasons that people love watching high-end sports performances, because you think, well, look, that's what a human being is capable of. Isn't that so remarkable? And I am one of those. And so that's a limit case, but there's obviously room for me to develop. And that's something that's very hopeful. And so if you are in dire straits and you've seen that other people can get through that, you think, well, maybe I could get through that if I could just learn how to do it. So
yeah. I had a guy on my podcast who had written a book. His name was William Reeder, and he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and he was shot down. Well, he was shot down 2 times. The first time he was shot down, he was able to make it back to friendly lines. The second time he was shot down, he was captured, and he was captured in South Vietnam, which is actually worse. You didn't want to get captured in South Vietnam, because then they had to get you to North Vietnam to the prison. And getting to North Vietnam while you're patrolling through the jungle for months on end is not a good thing. And at one point, he's in a 2-foot tall bamboo cage in the jungle, and his legs are shackled, and it's nighttime, and he's trying to sleep, but he's having trouble sleeping because the rats are gnawing at the wounds on his legs. And so knowing that someone could suffer through that and survive and get through and make it out the other side and then carry on with a completely productive life tells me that we are pretty resilient as a species if we can dig deep and find that resiliency.
Yes, well, that's exactly the kind of story that also makes you much appreciative of the fact that you have a bed in an air-conditioned room, that in a house in a town that's not burning to the ground with rioters, and you have that every night. And so you take it for granted, but it's still worth noting that it's a kind of miracle compared to all the alternatives that might manifest themselves.
Yeah, I think people appreciate that. I think people, look, how many movies have been made about war? Countless movies have been made about war. Countless books have been written about war. So human beings are definitely have some sort of a, I don't know if it's a fascination or at least an appreciation for the sacrifice and the effort that goes into fighting a war. And I will tell you, and I can't speak for everybody, but certainly me and many of the kids I grew up with, and then many of the people that I served with, that's what we wanted to do. I had some kind of an instinct.
That's such a great thing for you to be able to say, because I remember watching this kid once. I saw him in Montreal, and he was standing. He's a big kid, about 6'5", I would think. And he was wearing these punk boots that were like military knockoffs, essentially. And he was standing there. He's about 17 or 18. And he's standing there on the corner of this outdoor shopping mall carrying these 2 pink shopping bags and looking completely out of place. And I thought, if you went there and offered that kid a chance to go off and have an adventure, to have a battle, he'd drop those shopping bags and be gone in 2 seconds, because he wants something more than he's not built for that. It was so incongruous, he wasn't built for that. And William James, the American philosopher, said that we needed a moral equivalent to war, because war calls people to extremes, right? To the extremes in their life. And there's something about that was obviously compelling, as you say. It's uncomfortable as well to state that blatantly, because obviously peace is a desirable condition. But the question is then, well, how do you put sufficient adventure into the peace? And that's a very, very complicated problem.
Yeah, it's very true in the fact that in war, I was lucky enough to go, and I was lucky enough to serve in combat and to be in a position of leadership in combat. And in those situations, I was able to witness with my own eyes, on the one hand, the most heinous and despicable acts that human beings can partake in. And I was also able to witness with my own 2 eyes these soldiers, Marines, the guys that were in my task unit, making the most incredible sacrifices for their friends. So yes, there is an extreme to war. And like you said, it's not something you wish on anybody. And I had this conversation with Sam Harris a while ago, because he called me out and said,
yeah,
you're talking about how hard war is and it's terrible, but at the same time, you say it's the best thing that you have been through. And I asked him if he'd ever known anyone that had cancer and survived it. And oftentimes those people will say, it's the best thing that happened to me. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but I'm glad it happened to me. And that's kind of how I feel about war too. I wouldn't wish war on anybody, but I wouldn't trade it for anything.
So when you look back on your involvement in the war in Iraq and your country's involvement, how do you make sense out of it morally? I mean, we're in that domain right now. You know, you tell me already that you're pulled between these extreme views. You don't wish war on anyone. I mean, do you have a son?
Yes.
How old is he?
18.
Well, so then you think, I presume, but or perhaps I wouldn't deign to presume. If you could have what you wanted for him, would that be peace?
Of course.
Okay. Well, right. Why? Okay. So let's walk through that a little bit.
Of course. But.
Well, right. Exactly. Well, the other thing that you do, as far as, please correct me if I get any of this wrong, but I mean, part of what you're also offering to people is the call of a kind of radical discipline. Right now, you post on Instagram the times you wake up in the morning, correct?
Yes.
4:30, something like that, and pretty regularly. And I guess you do that to show people that you can get the hell out of bed at 4:30 and get your day going. And
yeah, maybe not. I would love to tell you that I was that, had that much forethought into when I started doing that, but I was on Tim Ferriss's podcast and he told me I should join Twitter. And I kind of said, what's that? And he showed it to me a little bit. And he said, you really should join this. It's a way you can communicate with people. And I said, okay, fair enough. So I signed up for Twitter, and then the next day I woke up in the morning and didn't know what to write or what to do. So I just took a picture of my watch and, here I go. And other people kind of noticed that. And so that's kind of how that whole thing started. But
yeah, well, it's not always the case that when you do something new and creative, you know why you do it. I mean, sometimes and even if you think you know why you do it, you might find out 5 years later that there were 10 other reasons that you did it that you weren't aware of at the time. Like, we live beyond ourselves all the time. That's especially true if you're entrepreneurial and creative, because you're changing who you are all the time. And there's no reason to assume that your understanding of yourself would keep up with the changes. Yeah. My take on the Instagram posts was, well, what I just mentioned. It's like, well, yeah, you can sleep until 10 o'clock in the morning if you want, but you can also get a jump on the day. And I think part of what makes what you're doing attractive is that there's so little emphasis in our popular culture, especially with regards to the so-called mainstream media, on discipline and responsibility, that there's a tremendous hunger for anything that pertains to that. And you have a right to be discussing that, I would say, because of your background, which, if nothing else, required a tremendous amount of discipline.
Yeah, and I ended up writing a book called Discipline Equals Freedom. And I'm lucky that I wrote it when I did, because if I would have written it 2 years later, everyone would have said, oh, everyone's talking about discipline now. So yeah, discipline, absolutely. Discipline does bring you freedom in life. And that's something that I kind of figured out over time.
So what do you mean by that? Like, how did you figure that out? And what do you mean by that? Because they're often, and the classic sort of, what would you call it? Romantic rebel is someone who is free from excessive order, let's say. They see freedom and discipline as antithetical, rather than seeing one as a precondition for the other. And so how did you learn that discipline was a precondition for freedom? If I've got the equation, how did that manifest itself in your own life?
So we'll start off by saying this. And look, I was a young kid. I joined the Navy to go in the SEAL teams. I went through SEAL training. I showed up at a SEAL team 1. And when I got there, and as I look back, this is a very powerful thing, even though it's very simple. I'm 19 years old when I show up at SEAL Team 1. I'm done with the basic SEAL training. And I have a goal in my head, which is this. I want to be a good SEAL.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to do. That's like, I don't know about anything else. This is what I want to do. I want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. I want to be a good SEAL. And so as a 19-year-old with all kinds of energy, and we haven't talked about my childhood yet, but I was kind of like a very rebellious kid. When you talked about seeing a kid that looked like you could have handed him a club or a battle axe and he would have probably been feeling a little bit better, I was like that. I was constantly looking around for a club or a battle axe because that's what I felt like I needed to do. And it was beautiful because I was running around the woods as a young kid playing Army. And I just went and actually played Army. That's what I ended up doing. So I never really had to force myself into some mold that I didn't want to be into. So I got to SEAL Team 1, and now I just want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. And so now that starts steering some of my decisions. And for the most part, it steered my decisions in a decent direction. Now, there were some times where, as I look back now, what I thought was a good SEAL was a little bit off, but luckily it wasn't 180 degrees off. It might've been off 30 degrees or 40 degrees. Right. And as I got older and more mature and I figured out more about what that ideal should look like to me, and I could keep chasing that ideal, that was good. But even to be a 19-year-old kid with a 70 or 80 degree corridor to move forward in is not a bad thing.
No, it's a gift.
It's a gift. Exactly. So then I'm looking around at other SEALs that were older than me and more senior to me and trying to figure out which one of those guys is a good SEAL.
Yeah.
And what I realized was that the guys that were working harder, for the most part, were good SEALs. Now there's just some people that are just way talented.
Right.
And they could show up, 3 minutes before a run or 3 minutes before we do a shooting competition, and they could just walk through it. No problem.
Right.
And that's great for them. It wasn't me. I'm not that great at anything, but I saw other guys that might not be great at anything either, but they worked hard. They showed up to work early. They did the drills that they were supposed to do. They had discipline. And when you have
has amalgamated statistics, and I hope I get this right, but it's approximately correct. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Right. And so, and I think your comments about talent are also dead on. It's like in any field of enterprise, there are people who are phenomenally gifted. And then if they work really hard, they're even more phenomenally gifted, right? Those are the people who break records. But that talent apart, hard work actually works. And with virtually everything, it might not make you the best at whatever it is you're pursuing, but it will certainly make you better than you are. And then I have this new book. I hope you got a copy because did you get a copy? Okay. So I'm bringing it up for a particular reason. I have a chapter in this book called, there's two that are relevant. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. That's one. And then the course, or what would you call it? A complementary chapter is work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. And that's also predicated on this idea that discipline is a precondition to freedom. So you were fortunate, like you had this goal, right? So that meant you had a goal, which is a really big deal because you could learn about goals. You had a sense of a higher mode of moral being, that I would rather be a good SEAL than the person I am now. Well, it's a code of behavior and a way of perceiving. So there's an ethic in that. And then you said as well, your conception of what good SEAL meant changed as you matured, but that's also fine. It wouldn't have changed unless you would have pursued that initial, only partially accurate goal. And so that's also a really good thing for people to understand is like, if you don't know what you're doing, aim at something. Is it the right thing? No, but it's better than just shooting randomly. So you aim at something, and then as you aim and you move towards it, you're going to find out why you're wrong. And then you might recalibrate your aim. And that's going to happen over and over because as you move towards a goal, it recedes or it broadens or it recedes and broadens. And otherwise you'd run out of things to do. So, but anyways, back to the story. You have this identity. And you said it was there in you all right from the beginning, because you would play army by yourself, even in the forest by your house, I presume. And
Yes.
how old were you, do you think, how long back can you remember having that as a fascination?
I do not remember wanting to do anything else.
So would you say, is that as early as 4, 3, 5, preschool, something like that? Can you remember playing when you were that young?
I can't remember, a specific age, but if I think back to, hey, that looks like what I want to do. I remember I want to be a soldier.
And you remember when you were a kid? I mean, I'm fascinated by this because, well, one of the things I really noted when I had kids was how much their personality was there right from the beginning. Like, my children are quite different. They have their similarities, but they're quite different from one another. And those differences were there right from the beginning, and they've maintained themselves throughout their lives. And so it's fascinating to see that destiny, in some sense, is built right into the person to begin with. And so, well, this was built into you by all appearances. And so it manifested itself in what attracted you, even in play as a child. And that's the beginning of identity formulation, that play. And so what was it about being a soldier that you think attracted you when you were a kid? Like, what was it that was so compelling? Because being a soldier is a multi-dimensional identity. There's the physical combat element of it. There's the strategic element of it. There's the discipline, the camaraderie. What were you playing, do you think?
I got asked this. I was talking to some folks at the Special Operations Command the other day, and they asked me, they set me up with this kind of beautiful possibility or opportunity for me to give some kind of an incredibly beautiful answer to this very question, and there was something along the lines of, at what point did the opportunity to serve and sacrifice for your country reveal itself to you, or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And all I'm thinking about is when I'm 8 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old, I want a machine gun and I want to go fight in a war. That's what I want to do. I would love to tell you that I, read some heroic book. I read the Odyssey and realized that I don't need to read any of that stuff.
Well, that wouldn't be relevant to do with it. 8 anyways, right? I mean, that's why I'm curious about what it was so early, And so, okay, so for you, it had something to do with weaponry, apparently. I got to tell you a story about my father, okay? Mm-hmm. And tell me if this produces any echoes.
Well, before you go,
yep.
Weaponry was like, for sure, that's fine, but it could be a club. I wasn't a kid that was obsessed with guns.
Okay.
It was, and maybe it was just, we're going to get out and run around with sticks and try and hit each other or get into rock fights. Mm-hmm. Did you ever have rock fights when you were a kid?
Well, we had ice fights because it was northern Alberta, but also dirt lump fights. And now and then those would have rocks. And I can remember it was usually the Protestant kids against the Catholic kids. I mean, there wasn't that much of a division between those two in our town, but the Catholic kids had their junior high and high school, and we had ours. And so our gangs were separate. And so we would have dirt lump fights in the vacant lots where buildings were being constructed. And those were extremely exciting. Now and then you'd take a dirt lump rock in the mouth, and that was a little bit on the painful side. But there's no doubt that it was extremely exciting. And so, and then
I cut you off about your dad and the gun.
Oh, well, my dad told me something, and then this might be more relevant to guns, but my dad collects single shot rifles, and he has a lot of them, like hundreds of them. And he's a gunsmith and makes stocks and hand carves them. And anyways, he's an artisan in that regard. And it's a real focal obsession. He's a great shot. He shot at the provincial level, which would be the state level in the US. But it was single shots. And and he hunted. And so we grew up on moose meat and elk meat. And he brought elk into northern Alberta as part of a repopulation attempt. Anyways, I could never understand his fascination with guns because it was really a deep fascination. So it was something that elicited my curiosity. And at one point I realized that he only hunted with single shots. So he had one shot at whatever he was hunting. So it had to be a good shot. And so he was pushing himself. And then I realized, well, he was really obsessed with hitting the target, taking aim and hitting the target. And it was about that time I learned that the Greek word for sin, hamartia, meant to miss the target. So there's this tight alignment between taking careful aim at the center of something precisely and then bringing yourself into alignment so that you would hit that target. There's a deep morality in that. It's a morality of hunting. It might be a morality of combat, and it's really deeply embedded inside of people. And that was what had my father in its grip. And so I was wondering if the automatic interest that even the club elicited in you had something to do with that seeking, that hunting, that target seeking. Or if, perhaps I'm barking up the wrong tree.
I would say no. But when you were talking about getting hit in the head with a dirt clump, and whether you get hit or not, when you get done with that situation, you are in an elevated state of mind, because that was dangerous and it was a very high level competition. Because even when you're throwing a baseball or kicking a soccer ball around, there's no real danger in that situation. But when someone's hucking dirt clumps at your head, you get a legitimate rush from that. And it feels good. And
it's exhilarating. One of the most fun, yes, there's no doubt that it's exhilarating. One of the most fun days I ever had as a child, this was less dangerous. I lived next door to a policeman, an RCMP officer. And we went out one day, I was probably about 8, into my neighbor's backyard, and she had green tomatoes everywhere, far more than she was ever going to eat. And we had a green tomato war for like an hour and a half. And he was moving them at a pretty good velocity. So if they caught you, especially in the head, you kind of remembered it. But it was exhilarating, and it was really fun to engage in that with him. And I really do remember that. And I do remember those, I hadn't until today, but I do remember those dirt lump wars. And there is an exhilaration in pushing yourself like that.
Yeah.
So,
and I don't want to give the impression that I was, running around with camouflage paint going to high school, or I was, I was doing a bunch of other stuff too. I played soccer, I played basketball. We had, a bunch of different bands. We'd play music. I played bass in a band. I sang in a band. I played guitar. We did all kinds of other stuff, but I was always kind of just in the back of my mind, sort of wanted to do that job.
All right. So you went to the SEALs.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us about that a bit.
It was awesome. You're making more money than you could ever figure out to do with, I'm 19 years old and I am the richest person that's ever existed in my mind, because I'm making whatever it is, however many $1,000 every 2 weeks. And, my expenses were nothing. And so you're just totally stoked. You got a great job. You're working out, you're shooting machine guns, you're blowing things up. You're hanging out with a bunch of other guys that like to blow things up, and you can fight each other at the drop of a hat. And then you get done with a fight and you shake hands, and then you go eat a steak. And so you're just in this environment, and it's perfect. It's freaking awesome. So what was it like? It was awesome. That's what it was like.
it's funny, you read accounts of the Navy SEALs, and I've never read it as enthusiastic an account as that account right there. And so then what happened after you were done your Naval SEAL training? What direction did your military career take?
Yeah, so I got done with SEAL training. I went to SEAL Team 1. It was 1991. I just missed the first Gulf War. I was all brokenhearted about that because this war had happened and I didn't know when another one was going to happen. And so what do you do is you train, and we trained a bunch. I did a bunch of SEAL platoons, which is you form up with a group of guys, you do a training cycle together as a platoon, and then you go on deployment overseas. And when there's no war going on, you go to other countries and you work with foreign nationals and you train them on the skill sets that we have and learn some stuff from them. And then you come back and you do it again. And then eventually from there, I went into where I became a trainer at SEAL Team 1 and taught the tactics to the SEAL platoons that were now training to go on deployment. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I got picked up for a commissioning program and became an officer in the SEAL teams, which moved me up into a leadership position. And then I did a couple deployments as a young SEAL leader. Then I had to go to college. The Navy sent me to college because in order to be an officer in the Navy, you have to go to college. And I hadn't been to college.
Where'd you go?
I went to the University of San Diego.
You went to the University of San Diego. What did you take there?
I was an English major.
All right. So you finished college, and then what happened?
You're not going to ask me why I was an English major?
Why were you an English major?
I thought when he hears English major, he's going to say, wait a second, here you are, this guy talking about machine guns and blowing things up. What in God's name are you going to go study English for?
I have to say that thought did pass through my mind.
Okay. Why was I an English major? I was an English major because, believe it or not, when you're in the SEAL teams, and especially when you're in the officer position, you have to write and read all the time. So when one of your troops does something and they deserve some kind of recognition for that, you have to write them an award. And if the award is written well, there's a much better chance that it'll actually be given to the person that you're writing it for. You have to write evaluations for your troops. And the evaluations that you write is how your troops are judged so that they can be promoted. On top of that, if you want to go do a mission, you have to write a concept of operations, which is a document, which is 5, 6, 7, 8 pages long, that you send up the chain of command, that then they scour through and see if they're going to approve your mission or not.
You know, that's so insanely important. You know, I mean, one of the things, I did a talk at Harvard 4 years ago, and I pointed out two things to the students in the audience. One was that a tremendous amount of civilization and effort had gone into producing the institution that they were now part of, and that everyone who was part of that institution was hoping that they would come there and learn everything they possibly could that was relevant and important, and that they would be the best possible people they could be, and they would go out in the world and do as much good as they possibly could. That was the essential mission of the enterprise. And that was really the case. And also that learning to write in particular was going to make them more powerful than they could imagine. And a number of students came up to me afterwards and said, I really wish someone would have said that to us when we first came here. And it's the writing part of that. I kind of got obsessed with that when I was working as a professor. And I'm working on a piece of software right now to help, which we'll launch soon, to help people write. Because what I observed in my own career, and it's so interesting, the parallelism is so interesting, but not surprising, is that nothing can stop you if you can write. And it's for the reasons you just laid out. It's like when you write, you make a case for something, whatever it happens to be. And if you make the best case, well, then you win and you get whatever it is that you're aiming at. And so, you know, you said, maybe that's why I didn't ask you why you went into English. I guess that might have been the reason, is that the utility of learning to write is so self-evident to me that it could pass by without question. But it's also interesting to think about how it fits into this broader well, let's say at least partially military/strategic way of looking at things. You know, you described the intense relationship between marshaling your arguments properly, getting everything in order on the page, and making strategic progress truly in the military sense, that those things are tied together very, very precisely. And it's obviously your ability to communicate as well. Well, look what it's done. You have your podcast, you have your YouTube channel, you have your books, many of which you self-published. So that ability to communicate I just can't understand why it's not presented, especially, not entirely, but especially to adventurous, well, let's say young men. We could say young people. You're adventurous, you want to make a mark, you bloody well better learn how to write. Because if you learn how to write, well, then you can think and you can communicate your thoughts. So not only are you deadly strategically, you become extremely convincing. And then you can go and do anything you want and no one will stop you. And that's never told to people. And I don't really understand why. You know, you hear the pen is mightier than the sword, which is just a cliche unless it's fleshed out. But the reason, you laid out the reasons perfectly.
Yeah.
You have to communicate what happened as well as having it had it happen.
Right. So you already connected the dots, but obviously not only am I having to write and present my argument, I'm also having orders being issued to me, which are written. I'm sure you've heard the term rules of engagement. Well, rules of engagement is a 12-page document that is in a bunch of legalese. And I've got to translate that document to my troops, some of whom, barely graduated high school. And so I've got to be able to do that. So I've got to be able to read and then write and be able to then communicate and talk to the team and brief them in a manner that they can actually understand what it is I'm talking about and what it is our mission is and why we're doing this mission. So that was why I decided to study English when I went to college, and
so that was a conscious decision.
Absolutely. It was a conscious
and with that end in mind, that it was. So tell me exactly what the decision was with regards to studying English. What did you know that, because it's not, as you pointed out, it's not self-evidently the most practical of pursuits and not necessarily what you'd expect someone with a military orientation to pursue.
Right. Here's the thought process. I want to be a good SEAL. The good SEALs that I see can communicate, they can write, and they can read. That's what I need to learn how to do. I need to learn how to do that better so that I can persuade my chain of command that we need to do this mission, or we need this piece of gear, or this guy over here needs to get an award, or he needs to get promoted. All those things are done by being able to write and communicate properly. And
okay, so let's say you take the example of a SEAL who's got it all, but this literacy. Okay, so what happens to him compared to someone who has all those skills?
Well, if he can't write well, and he's in charge of 6 guys, and one of those guys works hard or does something that deserves to be recognized, this is the responsibility of that leader to write that person an award.
Okay, so he can't reward his good workers, his good soldiers.
He can give him a pat on the back, but a pat on the back isn't going to get him promoted. An award is actually worth some points towards your promotion. And the people that are on that board that are giving that reward, they're never going to meet that leader, and they're definitely not going to meet that guy. There's no bias. It's based on this piece of paper that you hand in. You hand in this piece of paper, they read the piece of paper, and they say award approved or award not approved. Mm-hmm. Or you want to do a mission and you send that up the chain of command, and it's the same thing. It gets to a certain point where they're just looking at it and reading and trying to decipher this pile of junk that you put together. And by the way, if I'm in charge and Jordan sends me a concept of operations that doesn't make any sense, why would I possibly let you go out and execute an operation that I can't even understand what it is you're trying to do? So it has a huge impact. It has a huge impact.
Okay, well, I'm dwelling on this because it's upsetting to me. I would say that young people in particular aren't stringently instructed that the ability to that literacy makes them powerful in every way they can possibly imagine, except the absolutely immediate. And so it's just sad to me that it's not sold in that manner. You want to be weak? Stay illiterate. You want to be strong? It's like, put yourself together physically. Fair enough, man. Get brave and street smart. But then you could add some literacy to that and you're an unstoppable machine. So
I concur 100%. And, you said being literate makes you powerful. And throughout recent history, if we're trying to oppress someone, what we don't want them to be able to do is read or write or articulate themselves.
Right. Well, we haven't even talked about reading. We just talked about writing, and fair enough. So, but obviously you studied English, so you also read. And so what's the advantage to that as far as you're concerned, practically speaking?
Well, obviously there are so many lessons that you can pull out of books, and you can get to a point where nothing really surprises you because you've at least seen some indication of what can unfold through reading. So again, for me, it's very much focused on combat and war, but there's lessons that you learn and you say, oh, I've seen that before. There's a book, it is a book called About Face, which I think the last time you and I talked, I think you were writing the foreword for the Gulag. And I was about to write the foreword to, I don't know if that's your favorite book, but I was lucky enough to be able to write the foreword for my favorite book, which was re-released because I was talking about it all the time. And the book is called About Face. And it's about a guy that was in the Korean War and then he was in the Vietnam War, and his name is Colonel David Hackworth. But I would read that book when I was on deployment. I would open up that book anywhere and I would read 2 pages or 3 pages before I'd go to bed if I was in my bed that night. And there were so many lessons that correlated to what I was actually going through. And a real obvious example was when he was in Vietnam, he's working with the South Vietnamese soldiers and therefore by proxy, the South Vietnamese government. And guess what? They're all corrupt and they're not motivated and they don't have the right gear. And here we are in Iraq and we're working with Iraqi soldiers and therefore by proxy, we're working with the Iraqi government. And guess what? They're all corrupt and they're not well equipped. And how did he deal with it? How do we deal with it? So there's an example of when you read, you can learn, and you don't have to go through the school of hard knocks. You don't have to get punched in the face repeatedly with things that turn out to be situations that other people have absolutely gone through. And the level of capability increases so much by seeing something one single time. Well, if I see something one time, I'm infinitely better than if I'd never seen it before. So if it's like those little puzzles, they give you a little puzzle, some kind of a mind bender, right? The mind benders only work on you one time. The riddle only works on you one time. Then you go, I know the answer to that. That's the answer. You never get fooled by that again. So just seeing it one time, you're infinitely better. So when you read enough, you're capturing all these lessons. And you know what? I got to say this. It's not just reading. It's not just reading. And I learned this because as I started doing my podcast, and many of my podcasts are just me reading books, I realized how to read more intently, even more intently than I did when I was going to college and I was going to be, writing a paper about a book. And so I'd read it in a certain way. But even that reading was a little bit detached because you're looking for a theme or you're looking for character development or what have you. But when you read to learn about human nature and life, you detach less and you kind of put yourself in there and you experience it a little bit closer. And then when you take a step back, you go, oh yeah, I know what he was thinking right there because I was right there with him. And so there's a certain attitude. You kind of have to put yourself into the work and really read it with that kind of intensity, if for lack of a better word. Is it possible for a human being to read intensely?
Absolutely.
I guess so, because
Absolutely.
that's what I try and do. I get
well,
there.
That's no different than acting intensely or playing intensely. Of course, you want to put the book on. You want to become that person. And that can rattle you up, man, especially if the person is thinking all sorts of things that you've never thought. I mean, I love reading for that reason. I could pick my peers too, which I really loved. It's like, well, I have these people around me, but then there's these people who've lived before me and in different places, and I can set them up on my shelf. I can enter into their world, and I can benefit from everything they've thought and saturate myself with that person. It's very disruptive, especially if the person that you're reading has a mind that's more powerful and more well-developed than your own. I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche spun me around for about 3 years, and I was reading Jung at the same time intensely, and the same thing, it was very disruptive, but unbelievably useful to try on other people like that. And you get the benefit of their entire life distilled into their book. It's 30 years of work. I read this one book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which it's a great scientific work. I think it's the greatest neuropsychological work of the last 50 years. It's a very hard book. I think it has 1,800 references, something like that. And this guy, Jeffrey Gray, he actually read all those references and he understood them. And so it took me 6 months to read the book, but I got an entire education out of it. I got to experience in 6 months what it took him 30 years to learn. Like, what a gift that is. It's unbelievable.
I was listening to an interview with Garry Kasparov, I think you say, Russian. He was a chess world champion for 20 years, something like this. And they asked him, and the interviewer didn't ask him directly if he could beat this young guy named Magnus Carlsen, who's the current kind of prodigy of chess. He's just phenomenal and the highest chess rating ever, et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't get asked directly if he could beat him, but it was definitely implied, if I remember the interview correctly. And what was very interesting to me, Garry Kasparov, there was two things that I found interesting. Number one was he said, he's younger than me. And he didn't mean that like that was an advantage for Gary. He meant it, he's younger than me, so he has an advantage. Magnus has an advantage because he's younger. And I kind of thought to myself, well, that's kind of weird because this isn't a wrestling match. This isn't a jiu-jitsu match. Why would that help? And then sure enough, you learn a little bit about cognitive decline. And Garry Kasparov is 57 years old when he did this interview. And guess what? You start, well, depending on who you are, but you start to see cognitive decline around that time. And I'm sure
it kicks in at 25.
Well, there you go.
IQ is pretty unitary, but you can fracture it into crystallized and fluid. And fluid IQ is what enables you to learn. Mm-hmm. And it declines from 25 onward. Crystallized intelligence continues to grow, roughly speaking, because it's partly dependent on such things as vocabulary, which you can learn and which accumulate. But interestingly enough, you were talking about physically, the best way to stave off cognitive decline is not cognitive activity. It's exercise. Weightlifting and cardiovascular exercise it's by far the most potent means of staving off cognitive decline. Yeah. So Kasparov would have the advantage in terms of experience, but the younger guy would have the edge on sheer raw brain power.
That's what I thought too. But guess what? It's wrong. And it's wrong for the exact reason that you just said. So Magnus Carlsen, when he's 11 years old, he gets to open up a book and see every single match and move that Garry Kasparov ever made. Because that's what they do. They document that stuff.
Of course.
And so what he got to do was what you got to do. You got to learn a person's 30 years experience in 6 months. Well, this young kid, so this, where it might have taken Garry Kasparov, 8 years or 4 years to figure out how to get out of some particular quandary on the chessboard. Well, Magnus just opened to a page in a book and said, that if I ever get in that quandary, I'm there. And so what Magnus got to do is he got to start from here.
Right.
And build. And so I make this point from a leadership perspective.
Yeah.
We can do the same things as leaders. We don't have to figure all this stuff out. We can jump up to Gary Kasparov's level, or at least get a baseline of what he knew, and win because we learned. It's very interesting to me.
Well, you think, and again, with regards to selling this sort of thing, I'm stunned that it's possible to make history boring, for example. People should be so enthralled with history that they can't get enough of it. But with reading, you imagine you have this opportunity to learn whatever you want from the greatest people who ever lived along that dimension. And well, it's stunning to me that is a hard sell. It's mysterious that it isn't something that everyone is just clamoring for. I mean, to me, that points to a devastating failure, inadequacy of the education system, a mysterious inadequacy.
Yeah, I think maybe the transaction isn't always clear for people. I always talk about, well, if you're going to sell somebody a book, if I'm going to sell you a book, Jordan, you've got to give me $20 and 8 hours of your time, right? That's what you're going to give me. You're going to give me $20 and you're going to give me 8 hours of time, which you would probably, have other things that you might need to do. And the transaction's not always clear of what you're going to get out of that, especially when, look, you can spend a lot of time reading books and not get as much as you might want. You might not get your $20 worth out of a book. So you have to be somewhat selective. Now, luckily, it's not even that hard to figure out which books to read, because there's so many reviews and history about where these books came from and the productivity that they resulted in. So, but I think it's hard sometimes I can only speak for myself. When I was younger, it was really hard for me to figure out that transaction.
Yeah, fair enough. Like I had a librarian when I was 13 who told me what to read, which is what a teacher should do, right? There's nothing a teacher can do for you that's better than say, well, here's 10 books that will change you completely, and who actually knows that to be the case. And one of the things I'd really like to do, I've toyed with, with the whole concept of online education. One thing I'd really like to do is to divide up the variety of domains of learning and identify the top 10 books in each domain. So to ask an expert, it's like, well, you're a historian, you're a great historian. What 10 books are crucial? And I have a list on my website, a list of recommended books. There's about 100 of them that have been instrumental for me. And lots of people have used that list to purchase books. So that's been really good. But I'd really like to extend and expand it.
Yeah,
So,
I have the same thing on my website. The books from the podcast, and same thing. All kinds of those books get sold, and it's beautiful to see. But the people that are checking the website or listening to the podcast, they know that those books have been through a filter. They're there for a reason. They're there because they're going to be worth that transaction. And I think that's a tough sell for a lot of people. They can't figure out, maybe they've invested in books before and they didn't quite get the return on investment that they wanted, and buy 2 or 3 books and $50 or $60 and 20 or 30 hours.
Yeah, that's a great observation, I think, because one of the advantages to coming from a literate background is that you do, in fact, reduce the transaction costs. Because there's an infinite number of books. I mean, well, no, there isn't. But as far as we're concerned, there might as well be. And so the question of what to read really is daunting if you don't know anyone who reads. Where do I start? And how can I not be a fool in doing this? So, well, okay, back to English. So what were you reading when you were in university? Was it fiction, novels? Was it nonfiction? What were you focusing on?
It was like your basic English literature. That's what I studied. And so I read everything. I read everything, from each one of the little periods, and I took the various classes and really, as trite as this may sound, it was actually the most impact was from Shakespeare. It was the most impact on multiple levels. And I'll tell you the primary level. And when I've covered Shakespeare on my podcast, I explain this to people. People think, well, I didn't really understand. I read it, I didn't understand it. And so I start off, when I talk about Shakespeare on my podcast, I start off by saying, listen, if you think you're going to just pick up Shakespeare, open it up and read it and understand it, you're not going to, because it's barely written in English. It's barely written in English. It's almost another language. And so you're not going to be able to just pick it up and read through it. It's written in almost other language. So what you have to do is you have to start to interpret it. And so what I realized with Shakespeare is, number one, the weight of the words, that these words were so pregnant with meaning that you had to pull those words and parse those words and pull those words apart to see all the depth that each individual word had, and then the way that they're put together. And what was great about this was, by the time I was back, because then I went right back into the SEAL teams, and somebody would hand me a rules of engagement document and that was written by some lawyer in Washington, D.C. And I'd pull it out and say, wait a second, this word, I don't know what this word means. Let's pull this word out. Let's see what this actual definition of this particular word is and how that changes my viewpoint of these rules of engagement. And how can I translate that for my troops so that they actually know what to do? So that part, for me, was from a reading perspective, starting to read Shakespeare and saying, oh, okay, you're not going to understand this. And if you don't understand something, that's okay. You pull out the Oxford English Dictionary and you look it up. And then you not just find out what the meaning of the word is, but what's the root word and where does it come from and what kind of depth and what kind of...
Yeah, and that's really, that's unbelievably useful too, to discover the connotation of words. And the Oxford English Dictionary is particularly good for that, because you discover things that you'd never guess by looking at how the word developed. I mentioned the word hamartia, like the fact that the word for sin was derived from an archery concept was revelatory to me. It's like, that's so cool. It ties this moral concept, abstract philosophy, back down to something as primordial as weaponry and hunting. And just the fact that that's the metaphor is absolutely fascinating. And then there's the overlap in meaning that I already referred to. And virtually every word is like that, because a word is an ancient artifact. It's like an animal in some sense. It has an evolutionary history and it transforms across time. And each word it carries the echoes of its past with it too, because each word attracts other words in a particular unique way. So it kind of lives in a word ecosystem as well. And the ecosystem contain information about the history of that word. And you think, well, why is that important? It's like, well, hey, guess what? You think in words, you talk in words. You have all these archaic, these archaic entities, these words, these living entities that you use. It's like the more you know about them, the more you know about you, the more you know about other people, and the better you are at formulating and communicating your ideas. There's nothing lost in that kind of investigation. There's nothing but gain there. So.
Yeah, and that was the English road for me, and it was
good thing I asked you that question, eh?
Yeah, that was really, really insightful for you to come up with that.
Thank you. All right, so and did you enjoy university? Did you find a community there?
No. Okay, so when I was going to university, I was married. I had 2 kids when I got to university. I had 3 kids when I left. I was not a university student. I was, in fact, I would sit in the front row during my classes. I would have 3 pencils and 3 pens lined up and staged on my desk. I would be ready to take notes. If the teacher said something I didn't understand, I'd be sitting in the front row, raise my hand. I don't understand what you just said. Can you explain that? And meanwhile, I'm 28 years old. And there's a bunch of 18 years olds in there, and they just want to, go out and hang out with their friends. And I'm in there to, I'd love to really come off sounding good and tell you that I was there to learn, but I was there to